All right, welcome everybody. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. This is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States, and we are going to be pretty thoroughly focused. We usually do like econ minis, which is sort of a grab bag, but we're going to be pretty focused on what is the state of the U.S. empire based on what we know, and can it take everybody on, which some people are suggesting it should. Real quick, the show is generously supported at Subscribestar. The link is in the YouTube video description. If you're on Twitter, that's in my bio, my profile. There's a link to the YouTube channel. And most people support the show with a mere $5 a month, but it is greatly appreciated and it adds up as people contribute. That's it for shilling. Let's go. We have with us, let's do it that way, Black Horse. Welcome, sir.
Good to see you again.
Thank you. And Mad Mercenary, back again. Yay.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thanks for having me.
Hey, and Mad Merc, let's do it at more length at the end, but real quickly, mention the art contest, please.
Yes. Okay. Each year, for those who don't know, this channel runs a art contest. Whether that in previous years, we have run a currency competition, we've run flags, we have won book covers, and this year we are doing an album cover competition. I'll explain later at the end of the show, but just keep that in the back of your mind. And each year we also offer prizes. Last year we offered 3 silver coins to first place, 2 silver coins to second place, and 1 silver coin to third place. And we've had some generous offers for the prizes for this year from some of our lovely viewers. So I'll go into more detail at the end of the show, but just keep that in the back of your mind. We are running a competition this year.
All right. As we do every year. I think we started from the very beginning doing this, if I remember correctly. So
correct.
Really great tradition. Thanks to Mad Mercenary. All right. So we're going to get into it. Actually, okay, we'll introduce sort of the big topic, but first we have, in the tradition of econ minis, a smaller thing that fits into an overarching story we've been trying to tell, right, Black Horse, which is sort of the fortunes of Europe, because we are seeing various signs that, how do we put it? It seemed like Europe was going to rise, the euro was going to continue to be used more and more, and Europe would become, United States of Europe, right? There'd be the US and there'd be Europe. They would both be great powers on a similar level. Is that unfair to say, Black Horse? At one time, people were projecting that a couple decades ago. So
yeah, I mean, you would hear this all the time in the late '90s and early 2000s, particularly out of leaders of that emerging European coalition.
Of course, thus justifying the EU micromanaging everyone, I guess, or something. But anyway.
It was a narrative very strong in especially the European elite all the way up through the mid-2010s, and then we started to see problems with it.
Right. And so we have already started to tell that story, and we will be telling more of it. But right now, we just wanted to look at just the euro. How is the euro doing versus the US dollar? And so should I go ahead and bring that first chart up?
Yeah, please do. So we had been talking about the relative decline of the euro as a chronic story, because there's a chronic story to tell about it that goes back like 10 years. But it came to our attention over the past couple of weeks that there's actually an acute story here as well. So this is data coming out of, this is data about financial transactions passing across the SWIFT system. For those who don't know, SWIFT is a protocol for international money transfers. So if you send money from one bank to another, you send it over a SWIFT message. So what you see here is that from a fairly stable position for a long period of time, we have a sudden negative shock to the use of the euro over SWIFT, and a corresponding increase in the use of the US dollar, though not.
Yeah, I mean, you could maybe look for some other currencies to be, picking up a little bit of that usage, but it's clearly the US dollar that's getting the most of the benefit here, right?
Yeah. Yes, yeah. So there's a couple of implications to that. As people have been discussing the decline of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, it's worth putting that in this context. Actually, use of US dollars for financial transactions over the last 2 years is net up. Really, the currency that's declined over the last year is not the US dollar, it is the euro. And so that's really important to know when people talk about that as an element of U.S. decline. Maybe it will be over the long term, but in the acute sense, that's not the case.
Yeah, the U.S. dollar is what is it? Mark Twain said the death of the U.S. dollar is
has
much
been
exaggerated,
greatly exaggerated.
Greatly exaggerated, yeah. So that's the reality of that. Now, this second thing, we actually home in a little bit on something that connects to a story we've already told, right? So here we're looking at just the last 4 years, about 4.5.
Yeah. So the obvious question when looking at that sort of acute shock in the euro is what's causing it. So to try to hone in on what's causing it, because the SWIFT data is anonymized, you can't really look at, you can't break down the data. But what you can do is you can chop it up into shorter time series, which is what's been done in this chart. And what you'll notice in the shorter time series graph is that the extreme shocks to the euro, 2 of them occur in March 2023 and then in July 2023. And they correspond to severe events in the European banking system, the collapse of Credit Suisse, the severe distress of UBS. Forget it's a Swiss name, but anyways, it's the other major Swiss bank, and the severe distress of Deutsche Bank. So you have 3 major European banks, all experiencing severe distress during that corresponds to this decline, and you have you have the outright failure of Credit Suisse, which prior to its failure was one of the largest players in the global FX and FX derivatives market. So it's very likely that the shock you're seeing in the use of euros in SWIFT directly relates to these bank failures.
So banks matter, is what you're telling us, Black Horse. Right?
Well, bankers' lives definitely matter.
You've never mentioned that before.
Just for context for the viewers, these banks that suffered significant distress, were these investment banks, normal, just savings banks? What can we just expand on what type of banks they were?
Yeah, so these are banks that have large investment banking arms. They have a retail franchise, all 3 of them, but they have arms that deal with high complexity business. As I say, Credit Suisse was, prior to its collapse, one of the largest banks involved in the FX and FX derivative business. And because it was so involved in the FX and FX derivative business, you can understand why its forced merger with UBS might disrupt the FX markets in Europe.
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Okay, so anything else we want to say on this? Oh, I'm sorry. I do have a follow-up question for you, Black Horse. So when we look at the long-term view, it looks like I mean, you never know, right? But it kind of looks like maybe we're going to keep trending with the euro maybe going lower and the US going higher, USD going higher, right? But when you look at the time sliced view, you see those shocks that you pointed out, and we even have a pretty good rough guess at what those shocks were. So as they absorb those shocks, might we not expect that, kind of things go back to normal and the euro maybe it doesn't swing back to where it was, but it swings up a little closer to where it was before.
Yeah, I think it would be reasonable to anticipate some recovery in the use of the euro. The extent, like whether it goes back to 35%, I don't know, but I would expect that you're not looking at the beginning of it's not going to go from 23 to 0 in the next 3 time series events of this chart.
Yeah. Take that very last slope and just do it down to the axis. That's probably not reality, right?
So you're looking at with the merger of Credit Suisse and UBS, you're probably looking at a permanent change to the way that FX products are traded internationally, which will have permanent effects on the relative use of currencies.
Okay. So yeah, you do not see it just going back, like getting over the shock and going back right to where business as usual with the euro. It'll recover some, but it won't go back to where it was. There's been a structural change.
Right? That's what I would expect. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
There's a new normal.
New normal. That's right. Build back better, or don't in this case. Okay. Any other comments on that before we move to our main focus for today? All right then. Let's see. Where's that outline? So I like Black Horse came up with a wonderful outline for today, which divides our story up into, turns out, 3 buckets. Can the U.S. Take on all comers, right? This is I meant to share this as background, just in case the title, you have no idea what I was doing with the title of the show today, Turbo America, with a question mark. It's meant to be with a question mark. Anyway, here is an article. I've just shared the link in the live chat to the article Turbo America by Nicholas Soldo. And it's subtitled The USA and Its Quest for Full Spectrum Dominance Across the Globe. I recommend it to you. It's been much discussed in our circles, dissident right circles. And he basically says people who think the U.S. empire is like about to fall apart are deluded. There's the brittleness that Charles Haywood talks about, but there's still a lot of the U.S. empire is still very powerful right now. That may change quickly. Suddenly it could fall off a cliff any moment because of the brittleness. But for the moment, the U.S. swings quite a big stick and has a lot of economic might, a lot of military might. And he argues in this essay that the U.S. can take on Russia, can take on China simultaneously, or whatever. I think this question has come up again just in this last week or two because of wondering if what's happening in Israel and Gaza with the Palestinians there, that this could turn into a wider conflict that draws Iran in, and then the U.S. and Iran are fighting, and this becomes a serious front, right? So, can the U.S. keep fighting? It's not fighting in the Ukraine supposedly, but can it keep supporting what's going on in the Ukraine against Russia? Also deal with Iran, maybe deal with a Taiwan situation in China, which everybody seems to feel is teetering. That's the question we're asking.
Yeah, and specifically, the Treasury Secretary Yellen was asked this week whether the U.S. could, fund the war in Ukraine and fund a regional war in the Middle East, and her answer was definitively yes. So let's tackle the veracity of this claim.
Right. So we've got it divided into 3 buckets. We're going to start with bucket number 1, which is yes, we can. That is, what are the reasons to argue in favor of Janet Yellen's statement? And we start with the situation of defense spending. And I guess the fun thing that Black Horse suggests here with this is find where the war in Ukraine started. Now, it is actually there, right, Black Horse? There's that little bump right before the dashed line above 2023. That would be the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But notice how tiny that bump is relative to the war in Iraq, the post 9/11 invasion of Iraq stuff starting in 2003, and of course, then you go back further in the graph and even higher. You're looking at late Cold War spending, right?
Yeah. And if you go back to like where it's going to 1973, you can see where Vietnam is starting to wrap up. So
right.
the U.S. has been in positions where the defense budget has been at a significantly higher level of the overall budget.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. This graph is showing percent of this chart is showing
Yeah.
percent of GDP. Defense spending is percent of GDP. So yeah, the point, right, Black Horse, is yeah. Can the U.S. continue in Ukraine and do something else? It looks like it from this point of view, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things you should note here. First of all, from a raw defense spending point of view, the amount of money the U.S. has spent in Ukraine is not large compared to defense expenditures, in the recent past, like Iraq or Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So that's important context. If you can afford the Iraq war, you can afford like 8 Ukraines.
Yeah, and somewhat gruesomely, as I've highlighted on Twitter, you see people saying the quiet part out loud from the administration, saying, "Hey, look, this is great. We get to make Russia spend a lot of money and use up military resources. It's cheap for us, as you can see in this graph right here. Tough on the Ukrainians, but basically they don't care about the Ukrainians is what I took from that."
Yeah. And in the chat, there's a question whether the sort of social support of Ukraine is part of this chart. It is not, but the social support of Ukraine is something like 100 billion, which is, again, in the context of U.S. defense spending, it's a bigger chunk. You might, if you included that, you might increase the size of the bump to maybe the first 9/11 bump. But again, we're not looking at something out of character with U.S. history.
There is one more thing to give us a perspective, give us some context, and that is world military expenditure by major power. This chart starts in 1950 and brings us up to about a year ago.
Yeah, and the reason
go ahead.
The reason I picked this chart is because it's in absolute dollars instead of percent of GDP. So, GDP is a number that gets manipulated all the time. It's worth taking a step back and looking at absolute dollars. So like in terms of absolute dollars, the US is barely spending any more US dollars today than it was spending in like 1988. So
I'm sorry, this is inflation adjusted, right? It says constant 2021 US dollars. So this is inflation adjusted.
This is inflation adjusted.
Wow. So the US is spending about as much as near the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
Good Lord, what are they doing with all that?
Well, that's the other question. So,
what in the world?
Yeah, well,
okay, sorry. I try to remember that people are looking on phones and stuff, Black Horse. So let me just explain. If you look at the dark blue, that's the U.S. spending. The light blue is other NATO spending. So basically NATO minus the U.S. And then on the left of the chart, you have a sort of a dark red. That's the Soviet spending. That stops, of course, and is replaced by a darker red that is Russia spending. And then there's a light red. They used a lot of red here. Light red, which is China. And one thing that's a little shocker for me, besides just the magnitude of current U.S. spending while we're doing like nothing militarily, is Russia spending is just hardly anything.
Yeah.
It's not big.
Well, one of the things you can conclude from this chart is that the U.S. gets terrible value for its defense spending compared to other powers.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
there is something to be said about purchase parity.
Yeah, well, there's some issues there. So as I say, we looked at percent of GDP, we looked at this data, but again here, if you look at the size of the Iraq bubble for defense spending, there's definitely a lot more room for the U.S. to spend more money on defense compared to historical spending on defense. Now, just because the U.S. was able to spend lots of money on defense in the past doesn't mean it can spend lots of money on defense today. So that's kind of the next piece to look at. But certainly it would not be historically out of character. The other thing to point out here is, like, the Soviet Union in 1985 was objectively a much, much poorer country than the United States is today.
Correct.
And yet they managed to spend almost as much money on defense. So there's historical precedent for nations being able to, even in peacetime, being able to spend, a very, very large proportion of their money on defense. So, it wouldn't be historically unprecedented for the U.S. to make that reallocation.
Wow. Mad Merc, do you have any insights or comments on the fact that the U.S. is doing like nothing militarily and it's spending as much as the closing of the Cold War?
Nothing militarily is it's a relative term, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
being the world hegemon that the United States is, the United States obviously needs to have a large budget, especially in the modern age, if it is gearing up for some sort of conflict, or it believes that it will be experiencing some sort of conflict in the future. A lot of talk that you're seeing coming out of the DoD is not being caught on the back foot, not being one step behind. And so what they're trying to do is, by increasing their funding and increasing their presence, is being on the front foot and being prepared in case that conflict does come about. Well, now you could argue that by preparing you're actually escalating the chance of conflict, but
it's also true
that
that the U.S. still does a lot of the things it did during the Cold War, whether they make any sense or not.
Correct, and this is the other point I was going to come to.
Like the U.S. still sends their carrier fleets all over the world and wastes however many $1 billion on gas, sailing them through the Taiwan Strait or whatever they're doing.
And this is the prerogative of the world hegemon. And it is having to increase these sorts of patrols and activities as this world hegemonic status is being challenged. So, now
but people
being said,
should remember how much that all costs, right? A super carrier has a crew of like several thousand people, I don't know exactly, and it's got a nuclear reactor on board, and like the logistical the cost required to maintain these elephant walks that they do through the South Pacific is comparable to maintaining all the northern anti-missile bases that they used to have. So
So the US's idea of how it projects across the world is obviously changing as well. So what will we see the United States increase its budget in order to increase its activities if it feels it's necessary? I probably believe that we will, and I think that's the general signaling that we're seeing from the Fed and from the DoD. So, whether the U.S. doctrine of being the absolute supremacy at all times in all places for any reason is the correct strategy to take, that's that will be judged by history. But I would say it is an unsustainable policy if you're not going to get into a conflict to
it's
then
certainly
justify it.
It's certainly a very expensive policy, whatever else is true about it.
It is incredibly expensive.
I've got a nice segue here, Black Horse, to one of the points you were going to get to, which is when I said it's not doing anything, I was thinking about, active military engagement by U.S. troops, right? Yep. Like we saw in Vietnam, like we saw in Iraq. From that point of view, there's not much going on. I mean, I read antiwar.com. I know that, in fact, the U.S. is always bombing someone somewhere. But in terms of a major boots on the ground engagement, where all the divisions of the military are engaged, and there's ships and there's planes and so on and so forth, it seems like that's where you really start running up the dollars, and that is not going on. So, as you put it, Black Horse, only a tiny fraction of U.S. troops are actually actively engaged in conflicts. They're stationed all over the place. They're making themselves felt, but in terms of actually like out there fighting, there's not a lot going on relative to the size of the U.S. military.
Right? Yeah. So the point here is that if the U.S. military redeployed its existing resources without changing spending at all, it could definitely increase its combat effect in whatever theater it chose.
It can bring a lot to bear if it so chooses, wherever.
Yes.
In the world, pretty much anywhere in the world. In fact, it turns out.
The U.S. military is always on some form of preparedness and war footing as the world hegemon.
Right. It's part of the price of being king, right? Okay.
Correct.
Now, one more point on the yes, we can before we go to the no side, and that is the U.S. dollar is stronger than ever as a reserve currency. We don't have a chart. We've actually talked about this recently.
Well, we just talked about this like literally 5 seconds ago when we talked about transactions across SWIFT.
Oh, we do have a chart. Yeah, back to the long-term chart. There we go.
Yeah.
U.S. dollar better, hotter than ever as a well, maybe not hotter than ever, but pretty hot in terms of being used for international exchange.
Maybe we can phrase it this way: it's the best of a bad bunch.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, you're certainly
Most used.
certainly the death of USD is somewhat exaggerated. So, maybe as a diplomatic tool, it's less powerful than it once was. I think that's a pretty sound argument. Mm-hmm. But as a tool of taxation for raising money, the U.S. dollar is still extremely functional.
Right, meaning the U.S. empire is able to draw resources to itself. Yes. Courtesy of being the global reserve currency, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the yes case. Let's summarize it real quick. Defense spending is there's a lot of it, but they haven't had to do much for Ukraine. They haven't really spent much for Ukraine. It's been cheap, as they've been basically boasting. U.S. troops are not already actively engaged in any major fronts right now. And the U.S. dollar is in a very strong position internationally as a reserve currency. So now let's go to the no, we're bankrupt side of things, which is what we've been hearing from a lot of people, right?
Yeah.
No, you don't understand. The U.S. is about to fall apart or whatever. So let's start with this, this is quite interesting now. So it doesn't say it in the title of the chart, Black Horse, but this is actually a percent, as it's interest payments by the government on its debt as a percent of tax revenue. So
no. I made the calculation as a percentage of tax revenue. So that's raw expenses in dollars.
Okay, so what are you talking about? The percentage of tax revenue thing?
Well, so the percent. So you can superimpose a hypothetical comparable chart of tax revenue and figure out what percentage of tax revenue it is. So right now, you can see this chart caps out around 900 billion. So the U.S. government is spending about 900 billion U.S. dollars on interest payments, and they collect about 3.5 billion in taxes. So, they're and not only that, their tax collection has been so. The U.S. government has collected between 19% and 21% of GDP in taxes for going on like 60 years. So there's been no mechanisms. In that time, they've had high tax policy for income taxes. They've had low tax policy for income taxes. They've had all kinds of changes in corporate tax regimes, and none of it has made any difference whatsoever in their ability to raise taxes. Because tax evasion is a thing. They're near the center of the Laffer curve, so there's not much they can do to raise more money. And so you've got a relatively fixed line in terms of taxation, and you have this radically accelerating cost to finance their whatever it is, 30 odd trillion in debt.
Now that spike up there has to do with the rising interest rate right now, right?
Yeah, so there's two things going on. First of all, the U.S. since 2020 has run pretty extreme deficits, but also if you flip over to the 10-year government bond chart, the U.S. government has had increasing difficulty selling its bonds. So this is secondary market, so it's not. It's impacted by the way that the Fed manages rates, but it's not a direct. Nobody set raising 10-year rates as a direct policy, and so you have at the moment, every time that they have to issue new bonds, and they have to all the time because of their deficit, and because of the staggered nature of the way that of the duration of their debt, every time they have to finance new bonds, they're financing them at higher rates. And if you imagine having to refinance all 30 trillion at roughly 5%, you can see that the 1 trillion in interest costs that are currently being borne by the U.S. government are likely to increase very substantially the longer that this rate environment goes on. So if you imagine like what's 30 trillion times 5%, it's a lot more than one. It's a lot more than 1 trillion anyway.
Oh, wait, where did this come? I'm seeing a comment from Mad Merc. The U.S. credit rating went from AAA to AA plus. They got downgraded slightly.
Yeah.
When did that happen?
Earlier this year, one of the ratings agencies downgraded them.
I forgot about that. I don't know that we even discussed it at the time.
Well, I mean, ratings literally mean nothing for the U.S. government. So ratings mean something for other governments.
Uncle Sam says, "You don't rate me, I rate you."
Yeah. So like the single.
I'm not saying they'll care.
The single largest buyer of U.S. Well, there's two really deep sinks for U.S. dollar bonds. The first is that anytime you deposit money in a bank, that bank has to turn around and buy a U.S. government bond. So that's a huge sink for U.S. government bonds. The other very large sink for U.S. government bonds is all the nations that use U.S. currency to stabilize their currency. The Chinese famously have a giant reserve of U.S. government bonds that is designed to manage the exchange rate between the Chinese yuan and the U.S. dollar. But there are many, many other countries that also have extremely large reserves. Extremely large reserves of U.S. government bonds as well for similar reasons.
Right. Okay. So, yeah. So this is one of the questions people ask. Of course, given Janet Yellen's statement, right? It's like, well, yeah. I mean, but the U.S. can just print dollars forever, right? Well, there are some checks on that. Not really from other governments, it seems like, right? But of course, it's more from reality.
Yeah, well, if they continue on this path and struggle to bear the interest rate payments, the question is, well, why can't they just print more money from the Fed, right? Do quantitative easing have the Fed buy the debt? And the answer is, if they go down that route, like, it's very obvious that some of the price inflation that we're seeing is related to monetary expansion. So if they stop doing monetary they're attempting to do monetary contraction now and still experiencing consumer inflation. If they go into a monetary expansionist route by buying bonds through the Fed, they might have a really serious inflation problem on their hands.
Yeah.
So
and the other part is where do you draw the line at that point? And it'd be very difficult once people understand that this is the new precedent that's been set to not use it again and again and again. So,
well, I mean, they used it basically continuously after 2008. So it wouldn't be a new precedent. It would be going back to the pre-2022 precedent, at which many, many people in the financial markets expect that they're going to have to. But certainly what you're looking at here is evidence of pretty extreme strain in the U.S. government's ability to borrow. So it may be that U.S. defense spending is not large by historic standards, but their ability to manage further deficit spending is apparently starting to hit some resistance.
Okay, so shall we move on to the next point?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So something we've already, I think, highlighted, if I remember correctly, is the oil situation for the United States. There's something called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, shortened to SPR in this chart. And this is something they built as a result of the OPEC embargo.
Yep.
Am I saying that right? Yeah, an OPEC embargo in the 70s. Gas got very expensive. I was young. I was not a driver at that time in the 70s, but I do remember that things got... we never had locked gas caps before that. Yeah. And at that time, they started introducing a way to lock your gas cap because people were just opening the gas cap and siphoning gas out of people's cars because gas was becoming that precious at the time. So it got a little crazy. I remember this was my childhood. Anyway, as a result of that, the United States decided they needed to have a backup supply, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They built it out. It took a while for them to build it out, as you can see, in this chart. But by the 1990 or something, they had a good amount in it. It looks like they added even more a little bit later. But under President Biden, the United States has been drawing that down such that it is now about half the level of what it was. Well, what it was at its highest, maybe even what it was just under Trump. So what does this mean, Black Horse?
And critically, the last information we have on how much is in the strategic reserve is as of June 2023, which means that we could be looking at the rate that they were pulling it out. We could be looking at levels substantially lower than this at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which means that the conditions that caused the oil shock in the 70s now exist again, because just like in the 70s, the United States is a substantial importer of oil, and it has significant barriers to expanding domestic production because it doesn't have the internal pipelines that it needs in order to substantially expand production.
Must note that this was a bit self-inflicted, right?
Yeah.
With shutting down a pipeline that was meant to be bringing oil in from Canada. Am I saying that right?
Well, not just Canada, but also the upper Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
So the primary source of oil for the Keystone pipeline was supposed to be places like Nebraska.
Okay.
So it affected the Canadian oil industry, but it also had dramatically reduced. There's that element. There's shutting down permits on federal land. There's a whole bunch of elements of this that have strangled U.S. domestic production over the last 4 or 5 years.
Right.
And so you've now recreated the conditions for, and then of course we have a conflict where the U.S. government and two of the governments that control the Straits of Hormuz, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are both on the opposite side of a geopolitical dispute between the U.S. where the U.S. government is on the other side. So you could imagine the Arab states might well use the same mechanism again, especially if there was a regional war. They may well cut off U.S. supplies of oil and gas from the region. And the purpose of the strategic reserve was not to manage civilian consumption. The purpose of the strategic reserve was to make sure that there was enough oil and gas to run all those fighter jets.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the reserve that would be used in case of war, and we needed that extra little bit of oomph to get us through a tough period while we renegotiate supply lines and supply chains and where the actual secure regions for resource management are. That's what this strategic reserve would be for.
Yeah, and you wouldn't have imagined using the strategic reserve in the last 3 years.
No,
this wasn't really the situation they had in mind.
And so it's not obvious what the impact, if there were a regional war in the Middle East, just how bad the impact on both the U.S. sort of domestic situation and the U.S. global strategic situation would be. It may well be that you would have a repeat of the 1970s where you had a 3x in gas prices in the matter of a couple of weeks and gas rationing throughout Europe and America.
Yeah. And this is in conjunction with the fact that the U.S. has decreased its number of patrols in the Persian Gulf for about 2 years now. So they have less of a presence there in order to secure any sort of international oil supply lines in case of any sort of near Middle East conflict. And the people who would be affected most from that are the people who are at the end of the supply lines. So we're talking mostly Southeast Asia here and Northeast Asia. The U.S., while they would be hurt, and they would be, and Europe would most definitely be hurt as well, they have alternate sources of oil that they can look to that other regions don't. So let's just remember that it won't just affect the United States or North America. This will affect everywhere if something happens.
Yeah, although with the effect of the Russian sanctions, there's much more Russian oil going east than there ever was before.
That's
so
a good point. Yeah.
It's not clear exact. Like I think it would be a mistake for us to prognosticate that exactly what would happen in this event. But certainly the conditions are very unfavorable. And they're so unfavorable that you might actually have a situation where the strategic options of the United States are limited by this tool, in a way that they haven't been limited for a very long time.
A quick note though is that U.S. crude oil production is up around the 13 million barrels per day mark at the moment. So they have increased since the beginning of this year to try and build up that reserve again and to compensate for the other shortfalls that have come through. However, they could be in a much better position if they hadn't had made some strategic errors. Let's call it diplomatically.
Anyways, it's hard to know exactly how a market would respond to a shock, but certainly this is a situation to watch very carefully as we observe, the potential for a regional war in the Middle East.
I usually don't throw something in at the last minute, but look at this chart just to give an idea. Unfortunately, this stops in 2020, but there you see that crude oil production, U.S. crude oil production, just dropping like a stone.
Yeah.
In 2020, right?
Yeah, I'll send you the more up-to-date one.
Thank you. Just so you can see kind of the dramatic shift that happened there, where what I had been hearing that especially under Trump, Black Horse, is that the U.S. was getting to the point where it would be like a net oil exporter or something. Is that
normal? Yeah. So in about 2018, the U.S. became a net oil exporter for a short time.
Okay.
And the U.S. was prior to the ascension of the Biden administration, the U.S. was forecast to become quite a large net oil exporter. That never happened, but anyways.
Okay, here's sorry, one more chart, throwing them up on the fly here. Thanks, Mad Merc. This is U.S. field production of crude oil.
Yeah, so we see that there's been some
there.
We see that there's been some recovery here.
Yeah.
But we're still looking at you could have a very different shaped chart if it wasn't for certain decisions that were made.
Yep. Right.
Yeah. So the point here that's being made is, yes, the U.S. has recovered in much of its production capability. However, it could be in a far stronger position than what it is, especially when it comes to using that strategic reserve, which is primarily for in case of the event of military conflict, which is now down almost below half at this point. So if something does kick off, in that sense, they're on the back foot.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so 2 more points for which I don't think we have any charts or anything. One is we are hearing, and I don't know if we have like figures on this, but we're hearing about recruitment problems for the U.S. Army. I just saw a very amusing exchange with a young man that a military guy was trying to recruit. And the young man, shall we say, was not interested in fighting for the empire, shall we say, and put it in no uncertain terms. Yeah, something. Some people might be confused that I repeat this phrase that I got from Academic Agent. The U.S. empire needs to get white boys fighting its wars again. Well, why say white boys there? Is this just some sort of racist dog whistle? Well, actually, it comes from something that I did not know until quite recently, though it totally makes sense to me. Once I learned it, I'm like, based on like people I know and stuff, I was like, oh, yeah, that totally makes sense. And that is that though the military became racially integrated many decades ago. They made a decision from the top to become racially integrated a long time ago. This wasn't even in its integration. That is, if you just say people who work for the US military, then you get this nice integration story. If you focus in on who actually does the fighting,
Yes.
it's small town America, white males.
And interestingly, overwhelmingly, people who have generationally participated in the U.S. military.
Right.
So, like, if you're a combat active U.S. military service member, the odds that you had a father and a grandfather who both served in the U.S. military are extremely high. Something like 60 or 70%.
Yeah, and I don't know if you would know this, Black Horse, but there's a good chance they're from the South.
Yes, that's right.
There is a cultural aspect here. I think that there are multiple things happening here. Firstly, this is not just a United States thing. This is across the Western world.
Yep.
Okay.
Most militaries are failing to meet their recruitment targets for a multitude of reasons. Let's hit on a couple here. The first one I would say is generational. Most people know that we went through a demographic collapse in the last 40 years, and so there are physically less young people than what there were in the past.
Yeah,
And
we're well past the baby boom.
Correct. We're well past the baby boom at this point, and so in order to meet these recruiting targets, there's actually needing to be a larger percentage of the young people who are enlisting into the military, both officer and other rank roles. So, and that's incredibly hard because, as Black Horse was pointing out, usually this is a generational family thing. Usually, the same people from the same families enlist in the military. It's hard to convince a first generation to join the military. The next problem that you're going to see here is the alternatives that can be offered by private industry and by the wider market in general. In general, the military is good in some aspects, but in overall doesn't offer the career progression that most people are looking for, or the stability in a single location.
Bottom line, people in the military aren't paid that much, so you can't bribe them with money.
Correct. And that the lifestyle is a very particular lifestyle.
Wait!
So
I got to drop a comment about the compensation package. At one time, I think it was like, hey, if I go to the military, then I'll get like college education and stuff like that, and that'll set me on a path for a career. But I wonder, Mad Merc, if the fact that like everybody they can possibly shove into a college is going to college at this point has kind of made that a less attractive aspect of the compensation package. You know what I mean?
No, it most definitely is.
Yeah.
It most definitely is. The next problem is obviously there is a demographic problem here. So there are certain demographics of people that just don't simply want to join the military or the police force or the fire force or any sort of job of that type. There are certain groups of people who don't feel that they have any connection to the country that they may be living in, or they don't feel that that maybe they feel, for example, rightly or wrongly. I'm not here to say whether it is, but they feel rightly or wrongly that perhaps the nation is out to get them, or that they don't have any loyalty to the nation that they're living in. So these demographics, which are growing in Western nations, as we can see, are not joining the military. And as they become a larger percentage of the population, it becomes very difficult for the military or police force or whatever force to recruit from. And then finally, there is a general lack to fight for the gay, if we want to put it that way. And that most people don't want to fight for a nation that won't stand up for itself in most ways. And as civil unrest and civil discontent continues to play a bigger factor, what you're going to see is more and more people unwilling to risk their lives for a institution that is unwilling to invest in their own nation.
Mm-hmm.
So there are, and I'm sure there are multiple other fronts that people would like to attack this from. There's no one solution. There's no one thing here, but it's just going to be very interesting.
These are all explanations of why the recruitment crisis. The more difficult question to answer is how bad is the recruitment crisis, and the reason it's bad. The reason it's so difficult to answer is because when militaries can't recruit enough people, they don't just not fill the seats, they typically reduce standards. And so what you see is if you're seeing the US military admit that it's not hitting its recruitment standards, it's overwhelmingly likely that they've already attempted to lower standards in order to try to meet their recruitment targets and failed in doing that. So you're probably looking at a pretty serious problem, though it's very difficult to quantify exactly how serious.
Sorry,
the last factor, Mad Merc probably maybe I cut you off, but there's also the obesity problem.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. The obesity problem is quite a serious one. Obesity, especially in much generally fatter nations, and I don't mean to single out the US here, but the US is a prime example. The US has had to introduce, for example, pre-training programs in order to slim people down so that they can pass the entry exams.
Yeah, wow. And this is a big problem. Like part of the Turbo America thesis in the long term involves lots of recruitment and maybe even conscription at various points. Imagine trying to be a conscription officer and trying to make going through U.S. high schools and trying to make the young men in those high schools able to fight in combat. It would be maybe you could do it, but it would certainly be a very serious challenge.
So now I'm feeling bad about the joke I would always say, which is, you better not invade the United States because we will sit on you. But the problem is, as you guys are pointing out, is actually being heavy does not put people in a good position to be combat troops, right?
No.
Well, it's an interesting problem, and there's actually one more factor that I just thought of that's a bit interesting. As Black Horse was saying, militaries have a tendency to lower recruitment standards, lower entry standards, in order to meet recruiting targets. And what you actually see is that institutions that keep their high standards, but change the messaging around it and say, for example, we don't think you're good enough. You have to prove it to us. Mm-hmm. Those are actually the institutions that get the highly motivated and generally fitter and generally people who have the right attitude to be in those institutions. So mm-hmm. There are two examples I can point to here is that the U.S. Marines met and exceeded their recruitment targets, and the Royal Marines met and exceeded their recruitment targets because they both have that sort of attitude towards it. Whereas what we're seeing with other general larger forces like the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, other European armies, is that they're lowering the standards, still failing to meet it, and their advertisement and all their messaging is around this is a diverse place, there's so many opportunities, the pay is really good, you get to go and see the world. It's just not stuff that really grabs the type of mindset and the type of person that you need in these types of institutions.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, if you join the military for the paycheck, that's a problem.
Correct. Right. You do not join for the paycheck.
Okay, so let's move on to the final point against, we think is clearly against the Turbo America thesis, that the U.S. empire can fight Russia, fight China, fight in the Arab world, fight in the Middle East. And that is, that is sort of the nature of the Muslim world. Something we saw with, 9/11, for example, right? How did I predict 9/11? Well, that was partially because I was thinking about the way that Muslims felt about what was being done to Iraqi Muslims. And I didn't even think about it at the time, but to me, it was just obvious that this would anger people beyond just being those in Iraq. Sure enough, 9/11 was done by the Saudi Arabians, right? Well, why were they so upset? Well, there were some things in Saudi Arabia they didn't like, but one of the things that was particularly cited was the starvation blockade or the blockade of Iraq, which had so many people dying. And then this last couple of weeks, as Academic Agent highlighted on Unpopular Opinions, this hospital was supposedly bombed by Israel. Turns out maybe that's not true, but ignore that for a moment. And a black flag went up for the first time in history above this very important Muslim shrine in Iran. So what does this say? That says that under certain, obviously Muslims fight among themselves, but you know when my cousin attacks my brother, I'm together with my brother. When you attack my cousin, me and my cousins are against you, right? So under certain kinds of provocation, Muslims unite. And so the question is, if this becomes viewed as, the U.S. or the Great Satan, right, versus Muslims, well, there's a heck of a lot of Muslims. I don't know if everybody's aware. Now, Mad Merc would be because of the neighbors of Australia, but you've got Malaysia. I'm sorry.
So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this from
Indonesia.
From a numbers point of view. So there's 500 million Arab Muslims in the world, and then there's another billion non-Arab Muslims in the world. And not only are there a lot of them, they have a very different demographic pyramid than Western nations.
Right.
So many of the Arab nations have very high fertility rates and very young populations and not only very young populations, but very young populations where young men don't have particularly great opportunities. So
they have a traditional population pyramid.
Yes,
lots of young people, very few old people.
So the potential recruiting pool among the Arab Muslim world is enormously more favorable than the recruiting pool in the Western world. And so if there were a regional war in the Middle East, it's almost certain that you would see Foreign Legion type activity, however you want to term that, operate, and you would see an enormous pool of manpower available to the Arab states.
Yep. You would very much see the most Western nations become France. Or be in a French situation in their population centers.
Well, that's the other thing. You also have a significant pool of radical Muslims all throughout the Western nations that would be on the other side of this conflict, and so you would have to manage that problem as well. So the Arab world is very big. It would take a lot of resources to conduct this war. So when you think about Turbo America, you got to think about the domestic consequences of taking that on in terms of what you would project the actual cost to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not to say that the Shia Iranians could muster the support of all the Muslim world, because we know that the Shias are rather a minority, not a huge minority, but the Shias and the Sunnis are. It would have to be a great existential threat to Islam, or they would have to feel it's a great existential threat to Islam itself in order for these two religious sects to unite.
That said, the leader of Iran is meeting with the leader of Saudi Arabia today for the first time probably in my lifetime.
It would have to be a good 50 years since that happened.
Yeah, so it's unclear what would happen here, but certainly when you explore the logical consequences of this thesis, it's the resources that would be required in order to maintain a regional war would be substantial.
And then the next region you would have to worry about is obviously there's the Arab Muslims or the Middle Eastern Muslims, because I understand that Persians and Arabs are not the same thing. We all understand this. But you would also have to think India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Western China. There are plenty of regions where this could start to become an issue.
So, anyways,
it's not just a single front.
Those are the reasons on the no side, and
Yep.
the reasons on yes and no kind of break down into two categories. There's the sort of financial macroscopic reasons. Then there's these kind of kinetic reasons, like potentially lack of oil or the numbers equation issue. And then there's it's hard to say which way to kind of adjudicate the problem. If you look at historical major conflicts, peacetime financial numbers don't have what you would call an excellent track record of predicting the capacity of a society to maintain a war footing. So we were discussing before the stream, like if you look at the peacetime financial metrics of the United States in 1936, you would not predict that it would be able to sustain, nearly as large of a fighting force as it was able to. And yet that's what happened. So I think if somebody tells you definitively the U.S. can or cannot afford a second war, I think that person is not making a very informed calculation. But there are definitely some reasons to doubt that the U.S. can afford a second war, and definitely some reasons to think, there's a lot of ruin left in the U.S. before collapse. So,
okay. And this sorry, go ahead, Reddit.
Well, the big question in my mind, of course, is the nature of our elites. It feels to me like it's changed from when I was young, which, to be fair, was several decades ago. But it seems like they were, I always thought of them as nefarious and malicious, but I thought they were clever and,
yes,
and sneaky. And now they don't seem that way. They seem blundering, stupid. It's the bio-Leninism, right? Spandrell's bio-Leninism seems to be like every year it seems more and more obvious that they're becoming just incompetent. So a competent but evil elite would not want to ruin the game for themselves, right? They would not want to destroy the empire that they sit on top of, right? An incompetent elite will just do insane things and try to fight a bunch of wars that they really can't do. Keep on drawing from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and just put the United States in a precarious situation militarily. So that to me is a mystery. Is there some competence, dark evil competence, but some competence hiding there somewhere? I can't tell at this point. I'm actually really confused on that.
Well, I think as the empire starts to be strained further, you'll start to be able to get an answer to that question.
Yeah, right. And as Charles Haywood, who I recommend him to you, The Worthy House is where he writes these book reviews that he uses as a platform to say lots of things. He talks about how, yes, he agrees the United States empire is very strong, but he thinks it's very brittle. That is, a real crisis could show a lot of the stresses and cracks that we kind of are seeing, but it's sort of still holding together. But a real, hammer blow could break some of those stresses and cracks open, right?
Yeah, and again, that's a thesis. Predicting the future is a dangerous game. But anyways, hopefully we've given you some good ways to look at the problem.
We had one final aspect that we didn't put into the yes or no bucket because we put this on the table as a plea for information. Some people have suggested that there's an ammunition issue. Take the term ammunition broadly, not just bullets, but like rockets and stuff, right? So, things that get expended through use.
EO is the technical term. Explosive ordnance.
Explosive ordnance. Thank you. And that would include bullets?
Correct.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
okay.
see this
I didn't know
all.
that.
You see this all the time in the mainstream press. The argument that Western militaries are expending their reserves in Ukraine, etc. And the question is always: are these people just begging for money, or is this a legitimate issue?
Right. So
And
first of all, let's be clear. That could constrain action, right? That is imaginable. You know, they're like, hey, yeah, ship everything over to Ukraine and let them use it to hurt the Russians. We left ourselves with too little. You know, that is possible, but we just don't know. We do not have the information. It's probably secret.
well, yeah, and I would suggest that anyone who claims to have the information, who's not like a senior member of NATO or something, is probably
Right.
not providing a very complete view.
Yeah.
Correct. And
Any
even
comments,
if
Member?
this
Yeah.
if this is a problem, and we don't have the information to know whether it is or isn't a problem, but if it is a problem, then it is a problem that, in the event of any conflict, would probably be resolved through the expansion of existing manufacturing capability or the creation of additional manufacturing capability.
Well, but the crux of this argument is that the West is now in a kind of unique historical position where most of the supply chain for its manufacturing, including arms manufacturing, flows through potential enemies in a geopolitical conflict. So the argument runs that the historic expansion of manufacturing capacity that has occurred in other wars might not be replicable today. Again, this is a speculative thesis about which we can't render a clear verdict.
The super chat from Lady of Shalat brings us back to this issue of conflict with the Muslim world. She writes, in 2006, Colonel Gaddafi said, Islam will take over Europe without firing a shot. Gaddafi's regime kept the flow of Muslim immigrants back for years. And then, of course, famously, as Hillary Clinton cackled, we came, we saw, he died. And then the immigrants really started flowing into Europe. And we have seen some really horrible things going on. I was just thinking about the Manchester bombing in England at the Ariana Grande concert, at which, 22 people died, 1,017 people were injured. And I just can't remember if something was going on at the time. Oh, he's motivated by the deaths of Muslim children resulting from the American-led intervention into the Syrian civil war. Right. Okay. So that gives you a taste of the sort of thing that might be done if it's felt that Muslims are being harmed by the U.S. empire, people aligned with the U.S. Suddenly you have people being blown up throughout the West, right? Well, what if it becomes something much wider than the conflict in Syria, right? Now we have Manchester bombings happening all over the place because they're evidently some of these immigrants are capable of doing this sort of thing. So yeah, that's a frightening prospect. Wouldn't stop the U.S. empire itself, I guess. They would just say, we got to fight them even harder or something, But anyway.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question how much that kind of asymmetric activity actually affects the war-making capacity of the United States. It's very unclear.
Yeah.
So
right.
No one here is privy to what the actual impact would be on a detailed level. So, yeah.
All right. So I think we are good. Very good discussion in the chat. Thanks to everyone for participating.
Well, I wanted to end off with something here.
Yeah, please.
I don't know if you gentlemen have seen. It's a bit old now, but I've been away for a little bit. This thing where the women have discovered on TikTok that men think about the Roman Empire a little bit.
Right.
And I was watching one of those because I'm catching up on everything, and I was just thinking, when the Roman Empire was around, They faced the Vandals, they faced the Visigoths, they faced the Germans, they faced the Huns, they faced the Persians, they faced, the Numidians, they faced the Britons, they faced the Picts, they faced the Dacians, and they faced them on multiple fronts, many a time at the same time. But what really brought down the Roman Empire was its internal decay and the internal and civil conflict between the population groups, between its institutions,
The
between
classes.
the classes, between on multiple levels. And I think the thing that we need to remember here is that the United States, purely because of its geographic position, I don't believe can be taken down by a foreign power. And I think, like most empires, that it will be from internal decay and the decay of the elites and the people who run the empire that the cracks will begin to form, and that the cracks will eventually exacerbate. And I think that outside factors can affect it, outside factors can stress it, outside factors can make it worse, but ultimately it's the internal factors that will make or break the nation or the empire.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, I think we've done super chats. We've covered our topic well. Thank you both. I'm so glad you joined for this one, Mad Merc. This was right in your wheelhouse, our topic today. Mad Merc, could you please talk about our annual art contest and what we're doing today and how people can participate?
Certainly. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the description of this video, there is a link to the Discord server. On our Discord server, which is a very successful and brilliant server full of great people, including all of the gentlemen that you see on the show today, and many, many more. And we discuss economics, and we discuss a whole range of issues in there. And in that server, we have a competition. And as I was saying at the start of the show, we usually run one competition per year. Different themes and different designs in every year. And this year we are doing album covers. Just to bring everyone up to speed, the album cover can be of any design that you choose. It can be of any genre you can choose, and it can have any type of music that you choose. However, the designs must be original. The designs must have a front and a back cover. And you must, if you are working in a group of people or you are working by yourself, you must list who made it and whether you want to be involved in the actual competition itself. Some people just like to make it and be involved in it for the sake of being involved. Right. So, in
regards to the rules, did you decide about AI art?
AI art is not allowed.
Okay,
it must be generated by yourselves.
That it was new enough last time we did the art contest that we didn't really set an expectation, and then we were a little confused what to do when we got a relatively good submission.
Yeah. But yes. In addition, if you do win the prize is still to be decided. However, in previous years, we have given out silver coins, 3 for first place, 2 for second, 1 for third. We've had some offers from some lovely viewers about prizes that we can give out to winners or people who we think have done a good job but maybe weren't the top 3. And those will be announced later on. However, every year we try and go a little bit bigger and a little bit better, so prizes are still to be announced. If you do win, if your entry does win, what we do ask is that you message us and tell us how you would like the prize to be sent to you, or if you're working in a group, how the prize would be divided up. So, good luck. Hopefully you all get your creative minds and creative juices flowing.
Did you tell them how to jump into it? The Discord?
Yes, there's a link in the description, I believe. Unless you haven't put it in there.
Yeah, no, it is. So go to the Discord. The link is in the description. We have a Radical Liberation Discord community and another community that it's bridged to, which is on a safer platform run by our friends. The there you can participate in discussions, and we have a channel for posting the art, and you can see the full rules written out. All right. So that's the way to participate, is through the Discord. Okay, thank you, Mad Merc. I think we are all done with all the things. Oh, unless Black Horse makes occasional outside appearances, doesn't he? You had an interview with Jay Burden this week.
Yeah, I was on the Jay Burden show talking. Well, we had kind of a weird Q&A about Canadian politics. If Canadian politics is interesting to you, go over and check it out.
Let me see, episode 76, I think, or 76, because you've been on there before. So
yeah, it's the latest episode. Just came out a day.
Okay, yesterday. I just dropped a link to that, and oh, good, the boys were good here. And here is a link to the show for this evening. If you haven't had enough, the Old Glory Club, in which is a United States organization, does a weekly show now called the Pony Express Radio, Pony Express Radio, and that show will be starting in 2 hours. So if you're looking for if you're on the road, if you're trucking or something and looking for something else to listen to, I just dropped that in the live chat. Please cue that up for your listening pleasure with my colleagues in the Old Glory Club. And check out our Substack. We now do 2 free articles and 1 behind the paywall every week. So we're on a real rhythm there, and having guest contributors. And anyway, great stuff. So please do check that out. Okay, thanks, everyone. We should be back next week with Ryan, I think. He is busy with school sometimes, but I believe we'll have Ryan back, and we'll cover more about the transition from mutual aid, which the Old Glory Club is part of that, trying to bring mutual aid back. The transition from mutual aid to the welfare state, which is what we've all grown up in, right? And we're going through a book on that and learning so much. So thanks to Black Horse and Mad Merc, and talk to you guys next week.